Hello and welcome. Today I want to talk about my Earthshatter Auto-Warcry Champion. This is a build that I went into expecting it to be a very finicky character, and also expecting it to be a pretty expensive character. After playing the character for a couple weeks, maxing out the gear, doing a lot of crafting, tackling all sorts of different content, it certainly is a finicky character. And even if this is a little bit too finicky for you, I have several other build showcases or build guides. I also have several videos on Path of Exile mechanics, crafting guides, money-making tips, league start strategies, and many other things. So if you play Path of Exile, consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the notification bell so that you can see whenever I upload a new video. But it's not nearly as expensive as I expected. So to start with, what is Earthshatter Auto-Warcry Champion, how does it work, and how is it different from a normal Earthshatter character? The big difference is you don't actively use any Warcries yourself. They're all triggered automatically in sequence once a second. The core items I use in this build are as follows, and I'm going to name the items, then talk a little bit about their role in the mechanics. First, Facebreaker. There's no specific mechanical reason to use Facebreaker here, it's just a very good way to scale the damage without having to worry too much and allowing me to use a shield. A one-handed weapon could be used in place of the Facebreakers. Then my shield is the Eternal Apple. This is not replaceable in any way. This is part of the mechanics that caused me to trigger the Warcries. The Eternal Apple says that when you reach maximum endurance charges, you lose all endurance charges and trigger a socketed Warcry. So if I have +2 minimum endurance charges between the tree, my amulet, and my rings, whenever I gain an endurance charge, I will reach the maximum of 3, and I'll trigger a Warcry. You can also do this by modifying your maximum number, but personally I like increasing the minimum because that gives me endurance charges, which gives some defensive benefits. The second piece of this is Scold's Bridle. What Scold's Bridle does is every time I use any skill, I will take a small amount of damage. And the most important purpose of this damage is, I count as getting hit whenever Scold's deals damage to me, which enables the next part of Enduring Composure or a Warlord chess piece, which says gain an endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently. If I use any skill at all, I get hit, so I've always been hit recently, which means every second I gain an endurance charge. Because I'm wearing the Eternal Apple, when I gain that endurance charge, because again I have +2 minimum, I reach my maximum, lose all my endurance charges, and trigger a Warcry. This means, when it's all combined, you trigger a Warcry every 1 second, as long as you've used a skill within the past 4 seconds, which should basically always be the case. The upside of this is, it is way lazier than a normal slam build. You don't have to micromanage much at all. The downside is, optimizing the DPS becomes a nightmare, because you're not really able to front load your exerts. You're not able to say, okay, I'm on the last exert of my seismic, I've got my double damage from intimidating up, and I'm ready to go blast something. You kind of say, are things dead? Alright, my damage is good enough. And there are certainly some issues where your Warcries will desynchronize, or if your attack speed is too low, you'll end up overriding the best exerts, which is a significant DPS loss. So what Warcries should you use, what order should they be in, and does it matter? Yes, the order does matter. You should always have Seismic Cry as the first Warcry, and Intimidating Cry as the second Warcry. The third Warcry can be whatever you want, and there's a few advantages and a few disadvantages to the various options. First of all, Infernal Cry. I used Infernal Cry myself to help boost clear and speed up the build a bit, until I got my Explodey chest. There was a little lag associated with this, and if you don't like lagging and you find that a problem, feel free to use one of the other 2 options. The second thing you can use is Ancestral Cry. I know this is not a strike skill. This does not mean it's going to hit additional targets, but Ancestral Cry still gives armor. Armor helps to mitigate fizz damage, and you need a fairly high amount of armor to effectively mitigate large fizz hits. I did use this for a bit. Ultimately, while doing testing for recording this video, I found that the last option of Enduring Cry is much smoother. The only thing is, again, I ran into some issues with timings and setting everything up when I was not careful about which Warcry was in which slot. If you notice your Warcries are triggering in the wrong order, what you can do is unequip and re-equip your Eternal Apple. This will fix the problem. But assuming you have everything ordered correctly, I do like Enduring Cry in the 3rd slot. It gives a massive burst of regen, and causes you to gain additional resist and fizz damage reduction from the endurance charges that you will always have, assuming you went with the increased minimum endurance charge route rather than the reduced maximum endurance charge route. The other thing I need to talk about and clarify in terms of my gearing is the cluster jewels. Is it worth it to use them, and should you use exactly what I have? The short answer is, yes, it's worth it to use them, and no, you might not want to use exactly what I have. The double cluster version is a little bit higher budget and higher damage, but I do actually lose HP from running the double cluster. If I wanted to play this on hardcore, I would drop one cluster and invest all that into life nodes. Another advantage of running the double clusters is I get a good bit of my resist and all of my leech and some of my stats from these clusters, but you could easily make up for that if you ran just regular nodes on the tree instead, and those regular nodes might allow you to scale other defenses. The important things to emulate in the cluster setup that I'm using are number 1, make sure you have the flask duration cluster. Flask duration cluster's overpowered, and it's really hard to justify not using it on every build in the game, because flasks are great, it gives them uptime, and it makes them stronger. And then also, the Warcry Exert cluster, to specifically get Onslaught and add other additional utility effects, such as increasing armor, or dealing double damage during the downtime of Intimidating Cry, or possibly intimidating enemies if there's downtime on your Intimidating Cry, and you are not using First to Strike, Last to Fall. This just depends on where you are in your gearing, and how permanent or temporary of a solution you want. The final thing to note about using just a single cluster setup as opposed to a dual cluster setup, you do lose damage, but you gain a lot of life nodes. I could see the build easily getting as high as 7k life with a single cluster setup, so if you feel like you're dying too much and you just want extra tankiness, or if you're playing it on hardcore, I would absolutely suggest that. Regardless of how many clusters you use, it is very important to get slightly over 2.0 attacks per second. This is due to the way the Warcries work. If you are below 2.0 APS, you will constantly be overriding the best exert on your seismic cry. That feels really bad from my experience. The other important things to note on gear, having Poacher's Mark on one ring or casting it yourself on single target, having Flat Fizz on gear, these things are great to scale the face breakers. The goal of your passives tree should be to get all the Warcry cooldown so that it's 3 seconds or lower, get +1 exert, and get your APS to 2.0. After that, get as much life as possible, get other damage nodes or other defensive nodes as you see fit. The Watcher's Eye and Rizlatha's Coil do add a lot of damage to the build. They're very nice, but they are far from required. I just happen to use them because I could afford to, and it made the play experience a little more enjoyable to blow stuff up, especially as I was gearing around trying to do some 100% Delirious maps, and that's when the damage really starts becoming far more necessary. Looking at Ascendancies, Master of Metal is core to the build and a huge amount of damage. Unstoppable Hero provides stun immunity while also allowing you to keep your ability to evade, which is a nice additional layer of defense against melee and lets your leech function a little better. Inspirational lets you run an additional aura while still keeping your banner. First to Strike, Last to Fall intimidates enemies permanently, along with giving you adrenaline and healing you when you reach low life. You can set this up either with a weapon swap and a low life Blood Magic aura setup, or you can not worry too much about it and just treat it as icing on the cake if you ever do happen to get knocked to low HP. It will also remove ailments, which can definitely save your life if you're in a situation where you have a really nasty ignite on you. For early league or for hardcore, you might want to run Fortitude over First to Strike, Last to Fall, and then swap into it later on. The reason for this is you can get some more upfront damage and front load things a little bit better if you aren't running Fortify in your main links. Now, Earthshatter as a main skill has some very specific mechanics and how it scales with AoE. Check out my Earthshatter mechanics video if you want to see that. That is partially why I'm adding Pulverize. I checked my POB, Fist of War was worse, and Fist of War is less reliable damage. As long as you have enough APS that you will be over 2.0, most if not all of the time, while using Pulverize, you should use Pulverize, and if you are not over 2.0, you should instead use Fist of War. One of the biggest values of Fist of War normally comes in bossing, when you're able to line everything up and front load the first hit on the boss and just nuke them into oblivion. This build is unable to do that due to the automated nature and using skills, which is why I advise going with Pulverize. Fortify support is to give you Fortify and allow you to run First to Strike, Last to Fall. Brutality and Melee Fizz are just damage links. You can use the Awaken. It doesn't matter too much what you use here, just go with the highest damage. You're of course using Impale because you're an Impale build, and because you need Impale to cap things out and enable the Impale effect scale. So how does it play? What is it good at? What is it bad at? And what were my experiences? The build plays very well in maps. It's excellent. The clear felt very smooth. It's really nice to not have to think about my Warcries, think about what I'm using, just kind of go through, hit my Earthshatter, and everything explodes. In fact, I was surprised by how similar to a Cyclone build this Earthshatter build ended up feeling in terms of smoothness. It's not quite you're constantly able to deal damage while moving. And it's not quite that savior level of you can just walk away and watch things die. But it is really good. I did also try some Delirious maps. They're not terrible. I wouldn't particularly advise this build for 100% Delirious maps over a self-poison build, such as my KB Wander. If I didn't have the KB Wander as a point of reference, maybe I would see this more favorably, but by comparison to self-poison, it feels only so-so. It's definitely not as fast, it definitely doesn't have as much damage, even if it has so much damage that it trivializes everything else I threw it up against, including Cirrus 8 and Cortex and Delve. Which, speaking of Cirrus 8, just watch this phase, don't worry. If you blink and you miss it, you can always go back on the video and catch it again. And if he had maybe held still for a little longer instead of using all of his abilities that make him invulnerable, he probably would have died even faster. But needless to say, this build is a monster when it comes to bossing. This is by far the strength of a build, and my favorite thing about playing it is, if I'm looking for an early league bosser, I want to play melee, I don't want to play a minor, this is going to be my top choice going into the next league, assuming that none of these abilities get any nerfs or significant changes. And then finally delving. I didn't do a ton of delving, I didn't delve super deep on the build. If you want to see a lot of the delving footage, check out the videos that I released shortly before this, focusing on things such as the Endless Delve event, where I used a lot of footage from my Earthshatter character. But all in all, it felt good, and I could see the build going down to 500 to 600 very comfortably. The big things that I would take away are, number 1, don't automate your Molten Shell, use it manually. Don't forget that you have increased Fortify effect on Dread Banner. Make sure to use it if you're ever in a sticky situation, it can save your life. Enemies Explode is great, it helps you clear a lot, like with, well, pretty much every build in the game. And the build will provide a very smooth mapping and very smooth bossing experience. So overall, it's definitely something I'd recommend going forward. So now, my question to you is, have you played Earthshatter before, or have you played slams in general? And have you felt kind of turned off from using them by the fact that you have to micromanage so much in terms of your Warcries? If so, are you likely to give this build a try? And if not, what is your favorite slam build before now? Was it something like an Earthquake Bleed build? Was it maybe Perforate? Did you do a Tech Slam Chieftain? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this build and other slam builds in Path of Exile, or builds in general, down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And special thanks to all of my channel members who help support me so that I can continue to make videos just like this one. Your support really means a lot, and without it, I probably wouldn't be able to make videos of this regularly. If you want to help support the channel, click the membership button or the link down in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful and want to ask me a question in a more interactive setting, I stream at least once a week here on YouTube, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have relating to this video or any of my other videos. Thank you again, and I hope to see you on stream sometime. Have a great day.